Prevention Actional, thanks Ashley for hitting the record button. And Prevention Action Alliance houses the Ohio College Initiative for Student Wellness. And I am the manager, the community prevention manager for that program and network. And this particular project, Rise and Thrive, is a collaboration of Prevention Action Alliance and the OCI network with Ohio Mental Health and Addiction Services, Prevention First, the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health, and the Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse Prevention and Recovery, often referred to as HEC-AOD. And the webinars are developed to promote campuses and communities working together, hence the campus community partnership of Rise and Thrive, and provide the opportunity to engage with state and national experts on topics that promote campus and community partnerships and enhance student wellness. These webinars are offered for free, no cost, and CEs are always provided. This particular webinar, we are just offering prevention CEs, but the future webinars will be inclusive of prevention CEs, social work, psychology, CHES, and I know that counseling. So we're trying to check all those boxes. The webinars are typically on the second Wednesday of each month through the month of May. So our next webinar will be December, I gotta look at my calendar because I don't have these, I barely know what day it is today. I thought it was Thursday today.
December 8th.
Thank you. December 8th, same time, same sandbox. And we will be promoting the registration for that webinar very, very soon. So stay tuned. It's 1:34 and I think we can get started. So welcome to the Rise and Thrive Campus Community Partnerships webinar. Again, the topic is campus cultural competency, and I have two very special guests here with us today. They are Demarcus Merritt. He is the Assistant Director of Residential Life at Virginia Commonwealth University, and Dr. Aarika Camp, who is the Vice President of Student Affairs and Dean of Students, Goucher College. Welcome, Aarika and Demarcus.
Thank you so much, Juliana. And I'm going to share my screen. And so given my bouts with technology these days, we're going to hope it works. Can you see my screen? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really honored to be working with Juliana and Ashley, but even more so with my colleague Demarcus. And kind of what Juliana said is really the national scope of what you're going to hear. Demarcus and I are not in the same state. And so you'll hear some really good information, I think, from both of us from different perspectives that'll give you a broad range picture. So I'm going to go to the next slide. As you probably saw when you registered, we have intended outcomes. What good education professional wouldn't have intended outcomes for their session? And so that's also why I love working with PAA and Juliana. And so today you'll learn the importance of campus-wide staff in supporting marginalized students through cultural competency. Participants will listen and engage in discussion on how stigmas play a role in marginalized students, non-uses of mental health services. And then we hope you learn ways to engage Black, Indigenous, and people of color student usage of behavioral health services. So with that, it's one thing to say what we're going to learn, but I think it's important for you to know who you're talking to. So we'll introduce ourselves and get into the presentation. But first off, I've now been an administrative faculty member for about 20 years. I've been at Goucher College for a year and a half now. I joined the college during the pandemic, so that's a whole nother conversation we'll have at another time. And I call myself a super aunt. I have one nephew and he's spoiled rotten, but he's a really good kid. And then if anybody in the chat is a BTS Army member, I'm obsessed with BTS. And so if you know who that is, we'll have a K-pop conversation. But like I said, I'm the Vice President of Student Affairs at Goucher College. in my area of research has been senior leadership decision-making. And so what does that mean as the person leading a division? What type of decisions do I make that impact the experiences of students, faculty, and staff? And so it's a pleasure for me to be here. And then I will turn it over to my colleague, Demarcus, to introduce himself.
Thank you, Aarika. Definitely a pleasure. I echo those sentiments to share this platform. She dialed down her dopeness a little bit, but she's an awesome professional. So anytime you have a chance to connect with her, please do not hesitate to do so. You won't be disappointed, trust me. And so I'm Demarcus Merritt Sr. I am known as the diversity doctor. So I've been in higher education and student affairs in a number of roles and capacities for 12 plus years now. I'm also a father, a partner, and also an advanced doctoral student. I appreciate all thoughts and prayers as I finish up my last year of coursework, while also, learning and engaging in the pandemic. So the father identity, also just saying, my pride as a Black man is what I share in this platform as well. I think it's important to share that and name that, as it is often the foundation for which I see life, of how I make sense of things. I have two little boys. Eric and I were laughing earlier this week. Just they are a ton of energy. One is 4, about to be 5, and one is just over a year. So yeah, they've taught me, they've redefined my patience in a whole nother way. So as shared earlier, I'm assistant director for Virginia Commonwealth University, which is an urban institution in Richmond, Virginia. And then again, my company is the Demarcus Merritt Signature Experience, in which I serve as the Chief Operating Officer and the Diversity Doctor. So happy to be here with you today. Looking forward to the engagement and the collaborative learning that we will share.
Thanks, Demarcus. So I like to break the ice in an activity I call Flood the Chat Box, and it's not my idea. I got it from someone else, but I was like, that's a really good way to start off a presentation. By all means, this is challenged by choice. Again, Demarcus in our student affairs and our profession. So everything is challenged by choice. But what I'll do is that there's going to be questions that pop up. And so don't hit enter yet on your response to the question until I say go. And then you'll see in the chat box, it'll flood with everyone's responses. And so if you're comfortable answering some of these questions, these are some of the same questions that I put in here that we ask our students. And so I thought it's important to turn the mirror on ourselves to answer some of these questions also, because as Demarcus so eloquently said, his identity as a Black male, as a father, as a partner is what he brings to work every day. And so as you all are looking at your own identities, I think it's important for you to have some connection with other people who may be on the screen, but also think about your response. So just type in the box right now. You don't have to hit enter yet. But what is one word to describe the climate for your students on campus this semester? So one word to describe the climate for students on your campus this semester. For me, I'll put in that my word would be reacclimation. Some of them had like they had never heard of college. Some of them missed college. Some of them were just, I'm ready. So now you can go. Stressed. I see a lot of stress, anxious, quiet, transition, uncertain, lots of stress. I think that's all of us.
Yeah.
Nervous.
Yeah.
Overwhelmed. Good. And hopefully you're seeing responses where you also feel like, whew, not the only one.
Right. Not the only one. It's not just my campus. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you for sharing that. Let's go to the second one. Some of the questions may get a little more in depth, by the way. Given your identities, and Demarcus and I both kind of shared our own identities,
yeah.
Do you feel welcome and comfortable on your campus? So don't hit enter yet. I'm going to count you down to 5 and then you hit enter. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hit enter. Yes, yes. A couple of no's. Yes. Okay.
Yes. Okay. No. All right. Yes. Always. Okay.
Good. I like seeing yes. That makes me feel really good to see yes.
Okay.
And the no's, it's okay too.
Yeah. Thank you for your truth and your honesty.
Exactly. And believe me, Demarcus will educate us all on that. All right, let's go to the next one. How comfortable do you feel in having conversations with marginalized students whose identities are different than your own? And you can pick how you want to respond. You could say great, not well at all. So just type in your answer, don't hit respond yet. Okay, I'm gonna count to 3. 1, 2, 3. You can flood the chat box. Very quite comfortable, good, comfortable, pretty comfortable, fairly comfortable. Good, and welcome them, good. Seems like we're preaching to the choir, Demarcus.
Listen, we just got to make sure the train don't fall off the track. So
Exactly.
I like to hear that.
These are really good responses, and thank you again for answering. And if you ever want to take this activity for something you're doing, please do it, especially if you're having a more light and fun conversation. It's great to see people's responses that way. We have 2 more. Can always do better. I love that response. Yes. The next one, do you feel you are actively and intentionally addressing climate concerns on your campus? So I'll count you down to 5. There you go. Some people put it in. Go ahead. You can start flooding it.
Flood it. Working on it.
Try it.
No, trying, not consistently. Okay.
Good. And the good part is I figured once we get into some of these deeper questions, the answers will start to vary a little bit depending on your campuses and your roles. And so just think about how you've answered some of these questions in relation to what we're talking about in the services for those students. All right, last question. Do you currently know of, and you don't have to share the practice, but do you currently know of any specific practices or policies that may limit marginalized student engagement or use of resources on campus? And my apologies for typing of twice. So I'm going to count to 3 and then you can flood the chat box. 1, 2, 3. Yes, no, yes, yes, okay, maybe, good. Absolutely. Yep. And so just thinking about what some of those practices or policies may be that may be limiting that. And I see someone put in there, maybe in certain foreign language situations. Absolutely. We, in my last institution, we didn't have it where we can translate our web pages into different languages, especially for common languages for the area we were in. And so it did limit the students using some resources. They had to explain it to their support systems. And so thank you again for flooding the chat box with those answers, and hopefully it gives you some reflection as well as we move into the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Demarcus.
Thank you, Aarika. And also we want to echo, those questions are very great exercises to do with self-practices, right? And see where we are, continually gauge where we are as we're doing this work. And the most important thing is to be honest and to respond with integrity. So you know exactly where you are, what you need to address, and what resources and accountability you may need to build in. So when I thought about the topic at hand today and how we are thinking about how we support our students on campus, particularly when we're talking about overall student wellness and the promotion of wellness, I want us to check the connection strategies. Imagine with me, if you will, if you think about, I do it all the time when I go to bed at night, I plug my cell phone in and then I get up in the morning and I'm like, wait, my cell phone's now on 1%, right? It's about to die any second. And I realized that I failed to check the connection, right? And so I think holistically, when we talk about mental health wellness and the counseling in our organizations on our campuses, we have to check the connection. And so here's some strategies that we talked about and want you all to inhale, to digest, to chew on, to take back to your colleagues who could have had the time or space to absorb this space today and this information, that here's some tenets that we can work with, and so that we can try to think around and think about how we can build a better and improve those particular access to those resources. So one of the things that I found in my research is there's an importance of building trust before and beyond created spaces and resources. A lot of us, we pride ourselves on the things that our office provide our students, on the services, on the hours of operation that we're open, on the relationships we build with students, right? But we got to understand everything that we build to be accessible is not accessible. So how are we thinking about that? In a lot of, particularly with marginalized communities, it is a factor of trust. How are we building trust with those communities outside of the spaces of access and resources that we built for them? So we'll talk a little bit about that, how some strategies about what you can do to build that trust beyond your created spaces. And then work to understand, it is important to work to understand the historical hurt behind mental health. We all understand that yes, the stigma is real, right? The stigma is real with marginalized communities and accessing mental health resources, accessing counseling and different support mechanisms that may be in place in your organization and may be in place within your college campuses. But the historical hurt is most of these spaces, or majority of these spaces, in fact, if you dive deep enough into the history of higher education, it was not started with marginalized community in mind, right? So the historical hurt is there, is that a lot of things were put in place without thinking about what were the actual needs and the actual developmental things that marginalized communities needed in order to survive and thrive in colleges, right? So we're kind of backtracking and playing catch up as far as what we're providing in those services. So it's important to look at that context and understand that. That's why we still have, to this day, it's 2021, and we still have first generation students, right? That means some support systems chose the entrepreneur route, but there's also still a large gap as far as how accessible our college campus and higher education is. And then understanding what the truths and traumas around those stigmas. So yes, the stigma is real, but you need to actualize that, hey, either one, there's research out there that shares that marginalized, it's not just about marginalized students, but also marginalized families, right? How are we sharing that access to those? And there's a large gap of not only access in the college environment, but before the college environment, that these services are not readily available and accessible to these groups and populations of people. So some of the stigma is real, because I may not have known as a first generation college student that counseling was even a space for me, that mental health should be a priority, that there are resources and strategies that I need to take. So some of times we are sitting like, why aren't they coming? Where are their students? Why aren't they, accessing these services that we have? And it's how are we introducing it, right? And sometimes it's not just introducing it to the student, but also to the family, to their support structure. What does it mean to be in counseling? What does it mean to address your mental health from a proactive and an active standpoint, right? We also have to believe the narratives in the number. I know the big fight in statistical is that, quantitative and qualitative, which one is more important? They're both important. So a lot of times we make data-driven decisions and we formulate our resources based on the quantitative. What do the numbers say? But I want to challenge us to do a better job to lean into the narratives. What are the narratives saying? What are students saying that they are hesitant or resistant to accessing mental health related services and other support structures on campus? Think about it. We have to ask those tough questions and be ready to sit with the tough answers, right? Whatever they share, whether it's a group of 5 people that have the same similar experience or similar rationale, or it's one individual. Every rationale matters. Every narrative matters, and we have to lean into that narrative. We have to do a better job of collecting the information, not letting it just sit on somebody's desk, and then we're asking another research at another time, right? So, and then the other thing I really want to drive home is we have to make sure we are in the practice and art of decentering white scholarship only. As I shared earlier, higher education did not begin and was not founded with marginalized communities in mind. So we have to make sure we're taking a holistic review of all the scholarship that is out there. A lot of our chickering and a lot of our theories and researchers that are praised and heavily practiced in our work, and that we've structured how we operate are typically white and namely white men. And a lot of that research does not reflect marginalized communities on our college campus then nor now, right? So, and there's been so much research. So we have to dig a little deeper in the research realm to include those marginalized voices, to include the marginalized scholarship, to include those, again, for our students on campus. What are they saying that is helpful? I would say within the past 3 days alone, I found over 40 sources from different marginalized scholarship from authors of color that were talking about this particular topic. how are we positioning that resource to empower us to fully and holistically support our student? And then check the accessibility of the service, right? Is it in the middle of campus? I was working at one campus where the counseling center was basically off campus. So a lot of students who didn't have transportation, had different accessibility and ability and disability, they did not deem that space accessible. So the institution took a very a hard pivot, and they put that in, they actually relocated that services to be in the center of campus and also in a confidential area to hyper visualize and put it in the middle of traffic, so students understood that it was truly an accessible space. And then representation matters. It's no secret that we have to do a better job with recruiting, retaining, and pre-building systems of support for counselors and mental health professionals of color. We have to make sure that folks can see themselves in our office, can see themselves in the work dynamics, can see themselves on the college campus. And because when you see themselves reflected, there's an automatic, sometimes trust factor that, you know, I see you in me, right? So that's why it's important that we think about this thing. So if you're operating in monolithic structures or monolithic teams, we have to think about this differently, right? Who's missing at the table, and who are we missing because that person is not here, because that identity is not here, that affinity is not present. Think about the identities. Our student populations are so much, the diversity is so rich. And so we have to think about that in a very deep and intentional manner. And then the last thing I'll share with this particular connection shot is refrain from race matching approach. I've worked with colleagues before who will say, you know, I'm having difficulty understanding where this Black male has come from, and they will automatically say, well, Demarcus, can you handle them, right? And, you know, I'm like, handle them? Like, yeah, I think we want to rethink our terminology, but and I have follow-up conversation with that colleague of what that looks like. It looks like you're passing the buck and you're not sitting to embrace that narrative. It is discomforting, right? It is not comfortable to sit with something and say, I'm not sure exactly how I can help you, but I'm going to work and advocate and look for it and do the research and sit with the narrative, because sometimes listening is powerful support. So let's not make sure that we're not just passing folks off based on race or based on similarity, even though at times it can help, but it should not be the default. And some recommended resource and resolution, there's a lot here, but again, this is things we want you to take on, to digest, to do additional homework and research after this shared space. We can get into questions, but I'm going to review it very lightly and just think about things of how do we improve the access to mental health. And some of the things is just building mental health professionals and color hiring practice. One of the things I want to drive home with that is just making sure that before you recruit mental health professionals of color and other professionals of color in your particular organizations, think about what do they need to survive and thrive in this environment, so they aren't responsible for building that level of support for themselves, because that is also taxing and exhausting and takes away from them being available and accessible to the student and providing a quality level of service. And then you want to refrain from mental health and wellness as reframe mental health and wellness as an organizational priority. Too many times we have mental health and wellness as a pocket priority. This office handles it. Oh, this student group is leading the charge. No, the institution has to get behind it and put it into the strategic initiative, put it into the mission statement, put it into the vision and the blueprint of this is what we commit to our students. This is the culture we're cultivating with our student population and our staff. Also, the Mental Health Technology Transfer Network research. It's a great resource that has a list of things that you can be able to think through and think about how you better serve marginalized students of color when it comes to mental health. One of the most excellent things I saw and read and did additional research on was think about how you can build cross collaborations to promote positive health across campus. Mental health and the message of mental health can't just reside in your office. It has to spread across the campus. Everybody has to take a role. Just like diversity, equity, inclusion, and belongingness work, we all have a part to play. So it can't be in one part of the campus. Students should be able to walk in any office and know that mental health is a priority. Every office, whether it's a sticker, whether it's everyone has on a t-shirt that says mental health matters, whatever the case may be, think about creatively in our strategies and how we build cross collaboration. And then one of the things I want to, and I'll wrap it up here, because the other resources that are listed are things that, again, tangible take home homework for you to dive deep into after this presentation. If you have more questions, I can speak to it later, but the Equity and Mental Health Framework Toolkit by the Jedi and the Steve Fund are amazing. They provide 10 tenets for you all to think about, and it maps out, here are things you're going to think about, and here's how it applies to the student population. Here's how you incorporate mental health. So these are things that we need to commit to, that we need to holistically wrap our hands around and see, like, commit to incorporate into the daily nature of our work. And then last but not least, a lot of this comes to, yes, I will repeat that, Philip. I'll share that. I'll put it in the chat so folks have it. But I will commit, you need to, how you commit into the journey. And these questions, this is something that I have in my office. No, I'm not a licensed mental health professional, but I deal with mental health issues within myself, but also with the staff, with students. And this serves as a reminder of, what am I willing to commit to when it comes to mental health and wellness, right? And there are times when it's a little uncomfortable, and I'm like, oh, I don't feel as knowledgeable. I need to do more homework on that. But this table allows me to understand where I navigate emotionally and intellectually, so I can understand how I build my cultural competence. What am I doing? What is my level of knowledge versus those that I'm trying to service and support? And how do I make sure that I'm servicing in the most equitable and inclusive manner? And lastly, this is a cultural competence model. This is one, there are thousands out there, but this is a cultural competence model by the Winners Group that I think really is excellent and really drives the point home. Cultural competence is a commitment cycle, right? It's not a checkbox. You can't say, oh, I'm 10% more cultural competent than I was on Monday, right? What are we trying to prove by sharing that? We need to think about, how are we doing our self-discovery and self-development? Then how is that evolving of incorporating the narratives, experience, and the needs of other people? And you're going to continue to weave in and out of these phases and to build your cultural competence. You all shared that a number of you are comfortable speaking with people of different identities and of different orientation. Continue to build on that. How do you become more comfortable? How you become more fluid on the narratives and how folks want to be referred to and respected and treated. And it differs from one person to the other, right? Two Black males standing beside each other, we could be want to support and advocate for in two different manners. We need to position ourselves as professionals accordingly to support the individuality, right? And that takes time, and that takes investment in ourselves to, again, do that self-discovery and that development, as well as keeping an active awareness and education about others and their experiences.
Thank you, Demarcus. I had to unmute myself. I want to go back to the last slide you were just on as well, because the part about I love working on this presentation with Demarcus is even that I had to at some points look at his slides and take a second and go, where do I fall on this spectrum? And it's okay that in certain aspects you may be in one spot and not in another. And so for me, like, I feel very culturally competent when it comes to race and ethnicity, but I'm still challenging myself on the intersection of that when you come to LGBTQIA+ communities. And so I realized the other day, I thought I was really good with pronouns, and it's very common at the college that I'm at, we always use pronouns, ask people what their chosen pronouns are, what their names are that they want us to use. But there were new pronouns that came out a couple of weeks ago, at least for me, that I hadn't heard as much about. So I knew these, ziz, them, they, their, she, her, hers, him, and his. But then there were these other levels where I'm like, am I not checking myself and educating myself consistently to be more culturally competent, especially if I'm saying I'm culturally competent with race and ethnicity, they intersect with each other. And then when you put gender with that, when you put other facets with that, and Demarcus said it well with abilities on campus, you realize maybe I'm more sensitive than culturally competent. And so it's okay to move through that spectrum, and in different aspects, it may be different. And so that's the part that I love about surrounding yourself with colleagues as well, who are more culturally competent than you in some ways. And so having those support systems to have those conversations with are so important as well. And so I really honed in on this slide, as well as the slide before that was the circle about where do I land in terms of where do I feel most confident and comfortable in that. So Demarcus, I appreciate you sharing that as well and putting it on there, that it's a lighter scale that you move, and some things you may be more confident in and then in others. And so I just wanted to put that out there for you all as well, that I don't want anyone walking away from the presentation thinking, oh, I thought I was better than this. No, we're all trying to be better, and there's no one perfect in this, and we're all constantly learning. And so I wanted to put that out there as well. So I am a quote person to the core. I'm one of those people where if somebody else said it best, I don't need to say it. And so learn from the past, watch the present, and create the future. And I think Demarcus did a great job on that, and talking about the traumas and the truths of the students that are on our campus, and the generational themes that carry on until they decide to change them or break them, or maybe hold on strong to them. And looking at where we are presently, that can help shape the future we have at our campus. And so I'm going to get into some of what we can be doing on campus. And I so appreciate everyone putting in the chat box as well of, do you feel comfortable on your campus, and how are you challenging some of the campus climate? And are there practices or policies that you know at your campus that you may say, I don't feel comfortable with that. And you may not feel like you're in a position with implied power, or explicit power rather, where you can change that. But there are ways that you can, and there are things that we can think about. So what culture is being reinforced around support services, but particularly mental health services? So for instance, as Demarcus mentioned before, how are we starting when the families start at the admittance process to our school? How are we already enforcing that? Are we stressing that in the application process? These are the services we have. Do this align with the services that you require? And do these services, do you have questions about them? And framing them in a way that they're not reactionary, but proactive. And so what can you start doing before you become a student at the college or the university, where we can say, no, you don't have to worry about it when something happens, because you already started building that rapport. Also, how's the culture being supported and services being proactive, reactive? If the first time they see someone from your student counseling center, or the first time they hear it is when they're trying to go to a meeting, but not doing orientation, welcome week, housing move-in, during any of those parts, then you're being reactive versus proactive. And a lot of students, and this may be for ourselves as well, I go to people I know for things. I randomly just reach out to a random stranger and say, hey, I'm having a problem today. But if it's somebody that I had seen before, it's somebody whose name I've heard before, it's someone I have a friend who went to them before, I may feel a little more comfortable going to that person. So how are we incorporating, for those of you who are working outside of student counseling on your campus, how are we incorporating our colleagues into the fun aspects versus the reactive aspects? And so I know Demarcus works in housing. I used to work in housing, and I'm like, invite the counseling people to move in into other things now. And some may say, well, what if I run into one of my clients? They have them in a space where they're just passing out water and it's fun, but things where they can see that person and recognize them later. What trainings are mandatory versus suggested sends a really strong message to people on your campus. So for us, we have 4 modules that are mandatory for all faculty, staff, and students. And most of you probably have some of the same ones, which are DI work, which is Title IX work. But we also have one based on responding to students in crisis. And so really looking at that of how are you also encouraging other students to advocate for their peers that they see in crisis. Typically, students will know before we know if one of their friends are in crisis. And we can't just rely on RAs or orientation leaders or captains of athletic teams. If we're going to espouse this notion of being a community, how do we all take care of one another? And part of that is, how do you build out opportunities for students to alert you of other students that may be in crisis? And it's the same for staff as well. And I know Demarcus hit on that very well, and I challenge myself on that also. I can't just look at students as the only people I'm serving. Even if it's my peers, especially in the pandemic, I noticed some of my peers were struggling more than students. And so how can they help another student when they're struggling themselves? Kind of how Demarcus used the cell phone charge, which has happened to me several times, by the way. But I always like the example of a plane. If I don't put my oxygen mask on first, and I put yours on first, then who's going to help me? And then how can I help other people if I'm not taking care of myself? And so being cognizant about that, about the staffs we supervise, our peers we work with, and believe it or not, yes, our supervisors. Sometimes, especially as you move higher up, sometimes they're the only one, and we think they're the supervisor, they get paid. But that trickles down to us too, if they're not in a healthy space. Who are the go-to people on campus and why? I love the example Demarcus used of identifying as a Black male and somebody saying, well, here's another Black male, go to Demarcus. But there's also these implied go-to people on campus. And why are they the go-to people? Is it because of their identity, or is it because of how effective they are, efficient they are in their roles? Do students go to them because they're out and about and they know them more than just their roles? So really taking time to think about who are your go-to people. So I'm just going to ask you right now, you don't have to type it in the chat box, but think of a go-to person where you're like, that person is the person that students go to besides yourself, because I'm sure you all are also the go-to people. That's why you're on the session. But think of who those go-to people are and what is so special about them. But at the same time, ask, are they carrying too much of the burden on your campus for those students to go to, especially if it's not in their role? So I agree, it's all of our roles on campus, but are students identifying some of these other people on campus where you're like, why are they the go-to people? Lastly, on this slide, what practices have been implemented? What needs to maintain and change? And so I'll just give a couple of scenarios. If a student was in a session with you in a one-on-one or something and said, I don't feel comfortable here, I don't see anybody else that looks like me, what is your typical response? Or if a student wanted to change their name on campus but didn't do it legally yet, what is the practice? What is the response? What is the practice of how to have a session? I learned in joining Goucher the modalities of counseling that I'd never really considered. So of course I knew you could have some Zoom med, telemed meetings, but do you have a 24-hour hotline that's a crisis line for anyone to call? How do you schedule an urgent meeting for that day? Is it a cumbersome practice to say, I need to talk to someone today? No, I'm not in jeopardy of harming myself, but these are some of the thoughts that I had that I probably need to talk to somebody today. What is that practice like? Also, what is the layout of the campus? And I had that similar situation of the counseling center being on the fringes. And so if a student had to take a 20-minute shuttle ride to get to the counseling center session was an hour, then they had to get 20 minutes back to get to class. Are we impeding them from going? A lot of schools still have a number of sessions that students can have. And so some students will say, I'm going to stretch it out and I'm going to go once a month when I probably need to go more, but I'm going to stretch it out because I don't want to run out. What is your practice if a student needs a couple of more sessions? What is your practice if you need to refer them to someone in the community? Is that easy for them to find? Is that easy for them to navigate? Is it publishable for one of your colleagues to look up and also refer a student to? And so just thinking about some of those practices that are there that you need to maintain or change. I love the word looking at a monolith of our staff. Does everybody look like you? Even if that's all people of color, does everybody use the same language? Does everybody come from the same geographical Location, I like to tell people as well, just because we may have the same skin tone, don't mean that we're the same culture. And so really thinking about Afro-Cubans, Afro-Latinx people, thinking about Haitian, Jamaican, African-American people, we all may look alike, but we have different cultural backgrounds. And so what is that like on your campus for those students? The reflection of the students in the counseling center, and Demarcus hit on that. No, we're not expecting you to now build your counseling center where there's one person for every single type of student on your campus. That's impossible. But think about what the makeup of our campuses are. And if you are at a minority serving institution, let's say you're at a Hispanic serving institution, are there enough counselors on your staff that speak Spanish? Are there enough counselors on your staff that look like some of those students? Or are the counselors in the center also helping train up their peers? That's the other thing, is that we always have to collaboratively work together to understand what we may be missing. The other part, how do you advocate for the use of counseling center? For those of you who are outside the counseling center, how do you talk about them? What language do you use? Well, go to them if there's a problem. That's not really advocating for it. That's being reactive, but is it really advocating for the counseling center? Do you walk people over there even when there's not a crisis and just say, hey, let's pop in and say hi? There's typically someone not in a session or someone at a desk that you could just pop in and say hi to. If you're in housing or other offices that work directly with the counseling center, do you often bring them into your staff meeting and say, can you just give us an update on the types of issues you're hearing that we may be able to address? Are there eating disorder issues, homesickness? Also, in thinking about that, and I think, again, I keep touting Demarcus, he's more of the expert on this than me, but really thinking about how do you incorporate support systems in that? And that may not be parents, that may be siblings, that may be best friends, that may be partners, that may be spouses. How do you advocate the use of the counseling center and those supportive resources to those people who will advocate to the student to use it? So leveraging those relationships. Is the counseling center engaging student support systems? So is the counseling center as well going out across campus, and are they invited and welcome across campus to engage in those support systems, whether that's the student success office, whether that's if you have a care team, a threat assessment team, building those relationships so you can have some of those conversations that can help you be more informed of how to talk to a student. The prime example I give, and this is one that I'm going to ask you to flood the chat box again, and I'll count it down. How many of you know what the intake process is for a student to go to a counseling center session? So on the count of 3, you can put I do or I don't. So 1, 2, 3. I do, I do, I don't, I do, I do. Nope. I love the nope. I do. Okay. Good. So if you don't, I will challenge you this point this week. Go to your counseling center webpage and just figure out what is the intake process. And think about what that may be like for a student who's in their room alone doing it. And how can you help support them better do that? Are the RAs trained on how to help a student do it? The orientation leaders, athletes, are just their friends trained on doing it? Do we talk about it in orientation? But in order for that to trickle down to our students, it starts with us. So really thinking about how do we look at those support systems with that and what that intake process is? Is it a long form? Do you have to fill out certain things that may be uncomfortable? Do you have to mark ethnicity and gender? Those sorts of things, looking at what that process is, so then you can be able to say to a student, oh, it's simple. It's 5 questions. Fill it out. They'll respond to you in a couple of days or a couple of hours, whatever it may be. But you being informed of that is really important. And for those of you who said you do, kudos to you. When was the last time you checked though? Because some things may have changed in COVID and when a lot of schools went virtual. So really thinking about that. The last part, clubs and orgs usage. I know Demarcus is a member of a Greek organization. I was a member of several clubs and orgs on campus, and I cannot remember student counseling ever coming to one of our meetings. I had other people come to chapter meetings or meetings, but really thinking about from the club and org perspective, a lot of students get immersed into this club and org, and that's their family on campus. That is their, I know I've heard Demarcus refer to his brothers from his fraternity. And so even the terminology clubs and orgs use, they're trying to build that support system and family for those students while they're on campus. So how do we leverage those clubs and orgs to also, again, help their peers by referring to the counseling center and what support mechanisms that they may have on there for the students. And so I just wanted to put out some different ways that we can start looking at the counseling center and support services, because I know some people may have different levels of what you use the counseling center as, and some schools may have it outsourced, but how are we leveraging those support systems on campus for our students prior to a situation happening, or we need to, that can erase those stigmas, especially, and I'm going to throw, higher ed loves acronyms, so let me apologize, but how can we leverage that for our NPHC organizations, our IFC, our PC? So for those of you who are like, what is she saying? Those are Greek organizations. Those are the councils that Greek organizations fall under. But even for athletes as well, how do we go in and work with our faculty mentors who are advisors for athletic groups? How do we go even into RA events in the halls and leverage those relationships where they're just talking to them? It's not about reaction, it's just about promoting those resources. And so I know we are a little ahead of time, but I figured there will be a lot of questions, and I'm sure some of you probably want Demarcus to go back to a couple of his slides as well, because I was still like, yeah, I need a screenshot of that and I want to take it. So if you need us to go back to anything, we can. And then Demarcus is also putting links in the chat box as well. But please feel free to start putting some questions or comments in the chat box as well, and we'll be more than happy to answer them for you also, or even we can start somewhat of a discussion about that, of what we're seeing in the work that we're doing. I will say again, in case you wanted us to talk about it again, Demarcus is serving as Assistant Director of Res Life, which the amount of crisis response, he has more beds on his campus than I do on mine, I could only imagine. And then the Counseling Center does fall under my scope of responsibilities at Goucher College. And so I'm going to turn it over for you all to start putting questions as you see fit or want in the chat box. And if not, I always have other questions to ask you all to put in the chat box. So please feel free to put anything in there that you may have. I'll give everybody a couple of minutes to get some things. One slide, Demarcus, if you don't mind, I'm going to go back to, while people are thinking of things, they may questions they want to have. I know I talked a little bit about my experience when I looked at this slide. What was yours when you looked at this slide as well, when you put it together? I mean, I know you know this model very well, but kind of how you approach this slide in your work. And then, yes, I'm going to go back to the resources slide as well after this. I see that in the chat box.
Yeah, so thank you, Aarika, and an amazing job. I'm over here like writing and scribbling down, like, okay, I got it. I'm in classes in session for sure. But I utilize this cultural competence model. I stumbled upon it a number of years ago, and I use it as a framework of how do I digest what am I doing, as a mirror of, you know, when I have an encounter with a student, when I'm helping them talk through different situations, you know, thinking back through that situation in that occurrence with that student or with that staff member, and saying, you know, how cultural competent was I? And I think in before, I did not stop and ask that reflective questions. And I think all what happens too often is we service students, we support students, but we never make space, or seldom do we make space to reflect on what those experiences were like. Because a lot of what I, especially in crisis management, I still reflect back on to the first time I got a call at 2 a.m. as a hall director and had to encounter someone who was attempting suicide. And I immediately went to, here's what they taught us in August. And I think it was like October, November. I was trying to stick to the protocol, but in the process, I forgot to continue to humanize myself. And I said, wait a minute, this is no ordinary occurrence. I'm not going to normalize it. This is just something that students go through. This is just something happened. So I had some follow-up conversation, and our director at the time actually reached out and said, hey, I saw the report. How are you doing? And I said, I don't know. And I'm trying to come to terms of what I just, what just happened, not only for me, but for the student. Are they okay? Like, what can we do? What did we miss? And I had so many questions. And she just sat there and listened with me. And she sat there and said, we're going to figure this out together, one student, one situation at a time. And we talked about, but she really drove home, you really need to make the space to figure out how you feel. So I use this cultural competence model. And again, I weave in and out of spaces. I think more so often, I am looking at how do my views and values either complement or stand in conflict with other folks. And one of the charges that I have for myself, my professional career this year, at least one person that I find myself in professional disagreement with, whether it's a view or whether it's a decision, understand that was a moment and not the total picture, and figure out a way to continue to work through that. Ask clarifying questions, right? It was a statement, it was a belief. Understand what their narrative is. Why do they subscribe to that belief that they have? And that's what I think about. So that framework kind of, on a Monday, I'm usually on me centered because I'm trying to figure out like, where am I? Right. But then after some situations happen, after decisions have been made, I'm more of how am I positioning myself to understand and embrace the narratives of others, particularly the narratives that I don't necessarily agree with or have a lot of exposure experience with. And I have to dig and do a little bit more research and go back to the table. These students these days are teaching me so much and moment by moment. And I also let them know that like, I learned something from you today. How empowering is that for them to hear that from us as professionals? Because they also oftentimes will put us on a platform based on our positionality, based on our degrees or whatever the case may be. But I try to stay in a humbling servitude position that I am always going to be an active learner and engaging and embracing folks' narratives and experiences.
Thank you for that. One question I see popped up, and please continue to add messages about working in Title IX discrimination investigation, microaggressions on campus. And I experience this all the time in terms of right now, what was our bias education response team, which is now our campus climate education team. People can send in reports of use of microaggressions, and we actually had a very similar situation that happened to this incident, which I'm sad is happening at all. But a lot of times students want us to come back and say that faculty member has been terminated or whatever. But as we know, we can't share HR follow-up on those conversations. And so what I've been very privileged to have here is the leads of our faculty senate here. So we have shared governance with our faculty senate and inviting us in from that team to talk about, again, that training of what microaggressions are. So sometimes that educational piece is what's missing for some of our colleagues of, well, I just said that they had a beautiful dress on. Yeah, that's fine, but you were also talking to a person who is in transition in that class and they have a beautiful dress on and they didn't want you to acknowledge it. So sometimes really telling them that even the best intentions can be microaggressions. And then following up with the students, what I have told students before, I have addressed it, and this is how the conversation went. It went well. They've learned from it. They're going to a training, and I'll ask them what are they willing for me to voluntarily share. But the other part is also looking at some restorative justice in that asking if they would be open to having those conversations with the student as well about what they've learned, what else can they learn from it. And sometimes the student may not want to participate, and that's okay as well. But having some of those public conversations and bringing it up to their faculty senate, saying these are some of the reports that we're getting. How can we help you educate on what language to avoid? So you can at least go back to the students and say, well, I met with the faculty senate and address this in their upcoming trainings or in their upcoming meetings as well. Ashley, I don't know if you're still on here, but someone, they just popped up, raised our hand, and I know we're in webinar format, so I don't know if I'm able to even hear them.
Let me look into that really quick.
Okay. So you may, for those of you who raised your hand, you may want to put it in the chat box. I'm sorry if we're not able to do that because we're in webinar form, but if you can put your question or comment in the chat box, if we're not able to do that, we can address it. So Elizabeth, in seeing your response, that is a very tricky one to navigate. And so I would say trying to use those public forums to also let students know that you've taken their issue very seriously and trying to educate them as well as even if you, without using the faculty member's name or administrator's name, circling back to that provost or vice president to let them know as well. Demarcus, were you going to add something on that one too?
Yeah. So I think in meeting students where we are, sometimes we think just about the services, but we also have to be creative and innovative in our messaging. So in your messaging, I would definitely recommend thinking through what it looks like, particularly if you have students who are really social media engaged, which I feel like everybody lives on social media through some. I know I do, and I saw myself adapt because I saw that's where the communication wave was going for our students. But I would think through maybe how do you form a partnership between the student affairs and the academic affairs to create a campaign to project that microaggressions do not have a place here. And I think seeing those faces, seeing and publicizing your process. And not saying that publicizing name, as Aarika said, but publicizing your process to transparency, because transparency builds trust. So if you share with the campus population that here's how we receive the complaint, we investigate the complaint, here's how we follow up, here's how we maintain confidentiality of the reporting party and the respondent party. Here's what this process looks like. And again, wrapping that message back up of saying it has no place with us. Here are the reporting structure, because sometimes some of that hesitancy report is how visible is your reporting forms, right? There are many things that we know our generations are changing, but the less clicks, the quicker the access, the less clicks, the better. The quicker the access. So if your reporting form for bias or for microaggressions or racism, if it takes them 4 or 5 clicks to get to the form, you've lost them. That form is not accessible. If it's not front facing or on a drop-down menu, and honestly, I would say a form of that nature, if you have it in place, it could be on anybody's page. So if they go to any web page, here are reporting forms, whether it's the main institutional page or whether it's a counseling page, whether it's the academic affairs page, here's what they're reported. And again, have that consistency of the messaging across all units. Microaggressions have microaggressions, macroaggressions, biggie, small aggression. None of the aggressions have a place with us. And I think as you continue to build that, you start cultivating that culture into the mindset where the students don't know anything different. Like, absolutely not. We have a zero tolerance. And I think that's when they will continue to buy in that system.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. The next one was, what are strategies that you use to increase the diversity of your search pool so that the counseling center staff represents students of color? Any thoughts or suggestions? So I was just at a NASPA, which is the Association for Student Affairs, at a new Vice President Institute, and Ellen Heffernan, who's the Vice President, of Spelman Johnson, was on and was sharing that right now trying to find directors of student counseling centers and trying to find the directors of campus safety or campus police are 2 of the hardest searches right now, because so many mental health professionals are also starting their own practices as well. And so part of that is, how do you publicize those positions? So are you putting it on the Journal of Black Student Affairs Professionals? Are you putting it in those circles as well? But then also, how are you leveraging the staff on your campus if they want to, without, again, putting that on their plate that they now need to be your HR recruitment person? But if they're happy at your institution, they will typically put that on their LinkedIn page or in their social media groups as well. And if they don't on their own, ask them why, because they may not be wanting to bring in a peer or colleague who identifies as a person of color into that environment. And so really thinking about, your peers are also going to advocate to others, this is a good place to come work, or it's not. And so thinking about that, the other part is advocating of what, well, let me take a step back. Why would they want to come to your school or that location? And so for grad school, I went to a big state school in a very small city in a rural kind of southern country place. And I knew several people of color who were like, I don't want to live in that city. The school is fine. I don't want to live in that city. And so also understanding what is the town gown culture that will make it welcoming for those people to join. I'm very privileged that I live in Baltimore right now, and I moved from South Florida. So I've lived in very diverse places that it wasn't a challenge for me to find a place to get my hair done or find food that I like. But for some of you, you may be in locations where that may be a challenge. And so really understanding what is the landscape there, understanding those resources. So when you're in an interview, you don't necessarily bring it up, but I always ask a candidate, what will you need outside of this job to feel comfortable living in this town? And that was even when I was in South Florida, and this is when I'm in Baltimore, you would think, well, you have everything you need, but I might not for that person. So you being well-versed as a hiring person, as a colleague, of what resources outside the school and inside the school, it's important for you to also know if you have affinity groups at your school. So Black faculty and staff here meet every Thursday for lunch. And it's not a deep conversation. We're just eating and chatting. And so do you have those circles on your campus that will also welcome those people depending on what identity they want to project? So those are some strategies I've used as well. And Demarcus, I don't know if you have any you want to share with that also.
Yeah, professional staff recruitment is a core, is really a core competency that really in a value to me, because I think we could do much better as a higher education field. Much credit to what Aarika has shared about, you have to do your homework before you start recruiting folks and what it will take them to be successful. So when I was a recruiter in North Carolina in higher education, at a higher education university, one of the things I started to learn as I networked with other recruiters across the country is that I had to do homework. I was recruiting 24/7, regardless if I had a vacancy or not. And one of the key questions that I learned was, how are you telling your story, right? And whether that's social media, whether that's through services, whether that's through assessment and the data that you're looking at and reviewing, and make sure you look at the data and do something with the data that you're taking from your services. But when I say that is, what are you telling your story? I put together a social media campaign to talk about the institution I was at, to share very critical moments. So you can know before you come to this institution, you know what you're buying into. You know the things that we're working on and trying to grow through. You know the things that we're very prideful and that we're happy about, right? And we try to think through that creatively. And it started out a little one-man campaign at first, but then I had people sending me pictures or people sending me quotes to post, like, oh, Demarcus, can you post this? Can you do this? Go there. And I was like, well, first of all, this is my personal page, but I found I was very comfortable with merging the two because I saw the end result. The end result is when we couldn't get folks to recruit folks from the Midwest and over, Now we have multiple people from the West Coast applying to positions, right? And when we're at recruitment conferences, thinking about how you're recruiting, how are you learning what people need to survive? How am I taking a little bit of Cali and putting it in North Carolina, right? How am I bringing that, again, establishing those systems of support before they come and understand what's important to them? I was at a recruitment conference and I had a recruit say, you know, before today, I had no clue where this school was or who y'all were, but I'm leaving this conference knowing exactly what y'all stand for. And that spoke volumes to me, because of all the hard work and all the things that the team had done was really paying off, because that had raised our visibility of that department in that institutional profile. But it all starts with having an honest conversation with yourselves of who is at the table, who has historically not been here and why. How do we remove the table and make more chairs? Or how do we remove the table, period, so more people can be in the room and in the conversation? You have to own that truth. And one of the truths I started with was, at that time, we were severely lacking in professionals of color. And so we had to, and then I had to really dig down, because professional of color is a wide spectrum. Who's not here? And I've had candidates tell me, you know, we reach out to them, make a soft offer, and they turn us down. It's like, I did not want to come here and be the only. Now I can sit on that data and say, man, dang, we lost that one. But I go back to the director and say, this is what I'm hearing. We need to do better. We need to build a system that will make this person feel like they're going to be comfortable, that they're going to be welcome, that they're going to belong, that they won't have to be the only, right? Even if it's the fact that physically you're the only, but we don't make you feel like you're the only, that you are that one voice for your entire race and population. How are we putting these into practice? So we start to have those conversations to tackle some of those silos and those barriers and those realities. But again, it started with ownership, and we had to really take responsibility that we were not doing very well in some recruitment practices, and we had to really reimagine our recruitment. So one of the 4 things is, what is your reality? Recognition. You got to look at how you recognize your staff. 4 is how intentional are you with your recruitment, and then also what your retention practice starts way before it starts, not when the person is hired, but starts with onboarding. It's the complete process. We put in a system when the recognition and the retention piece was on the 1st and 3rd work anniversary of every staff, they would get a note and a small gift card. Get some ice cream. It wasn't a large, budget. Even before COVID, budgets was a challenge, right? But it was saying, hey, we see you, we thank you, we recognize the worth that you brought to this work. And those people, I know, we had one who, she had a salary that offered from another institution that she really should have taken, but she did not, because she was like, you know what, I'm connected to what y'all are doing here. So that money right now is not really important to me. And again, that spoke volumes, and it takes work, and you got to get that investment from everybody, because everybody plays a part. Everybody has a responsibility in how you recruit and how you retain staff members.
Absolutely. And again, this is why he's the diversity doctor. So the next question I see, speak to how to be proactive with introducing counseling services to students when there are negative stigma attached. Yeah. I would say one of the first things that you can do, and I've seen several schools do this campaign of, are there students who've had positive experiences with counseling that you can leverage? So for instance, if you ask one of those students who you have a connection with in the counseling center, are you willing to be a part of a campaign where we put out there what the services are like? Can a student write up what their experiences has been in the newspaper or whatever platform works really well at your campus? For marketing materials for the counseling center, who are you putting in those marketing materials? One thing that I will say, which I think is a nation trend, but this was one of the first schools I've been at that had it, that's called Fresh Check Day. And we had it within the first 45 days of the semester, where it's kind of like think of your involvement fair for clubs and orgs, but this one is around mental health support systems. It's around identity development. It's around all those different pieces where you're in the first 45 days, which we know students will make their decision typically in the first 45 days if they want to stay or not. or if they like the school or not. They haven't even, some of them hadn't even made it to midterms yet, but that first 30 to 45 days, they will know that. And so we made it fun to talk about wellness. And even the new theme right now, if you're following pop culture, there's a radio host named Charlemagne the God, who's really talking a lot about mental health for especially African Americans, but African American males. And the theme is mental health is health. And so having that counseling center approach, not just be, this is the counseling center, but this is a part of, like Demarcus said, a part of the fabric of our culture. So like going to the gym, going to the dining hall, walking around campus, going to the campus bar, counseling center, just pop in. So how do you take some of that weight off that this is that place? But at the same time, how do you market it where other students are hearing from other students? I say it all the time. The best marketing is word of mouth from somebody you trust. And the best kind of marketing is to see somebody who looks like you, identifies as you, whatever, that will tell you this was my experience. So looking at what your campaigns and marketing is, also looking at some of the student leaders who carry a lot of weight on campus, and it may not be a student who has a title. So I always say, and Demarcus, I don't know if you agree, within a residence hall, outside the RAs, there's always a couple of students who know everybody and know everything. And so how do you tap into those students to, again, talk about what the experience has been? And the last part I'll say again, tapping into those support systems once they start. So one of my colleagues who was the associate dean of students at my last institution, once we started the admittance process, we started inviting families to sessions and had them start talking about, what is the empty nest going to be like for you? Do you know what the resources are for your student once they're here? And once we got into the student support system and said, these are the resources, can you advocate for us? Then we also at Family and Friends Weekend, we called it Family and Friends Weekend, had a session there for parents to come to and families and friends to come to, where they met with some of our counselors, where they talked about some of the issues are. And we had a session just for those support systems on resiliency. So how do you bounce back when your student is telling you that they're struggling on something? How do you not swoop in with the cape and fix it, but you be there as a support system, as a trampoline where they bounce off of you and bounce right back to us? So those are just some ways. I didn't know if you had others, Demarcus.
Yeah, one of the things I really love that you shared earlier was, I remember, even now in working with undergraduate Greek fraternity members, that, we didn't do partnerships with counseling, right? But that is an untapped gold mine, because it's already a preformed circle. There's already trust happening. Some of it can be mandated by the membership. So, so you build onto those things. But I would say anytime before you engage a partnership, ask yourself, how is this going to be mutually beneficial? Because then that is how the trust will start to build, and not for just one moment, it will start to build in residual manner. I remember when I was at the University of Florida, and we were struggling in recruiting staff of color at the resident advisor position. And what we realized is that our tactics and our structure really didn't allow for us to recruit, because 90% of our population for students that live on campus identified as white. Right. So if we're only having recruitment fairs and tabling in the halls, that's who we're going to recruit. So we made relationships with our Black Affairs office, with our Latinx office, with our LGBTQI+ offices. And we asked and say, hey, would it be okay if we come into your space? Could we be invited to have our table and fair here and cater the entire presentation and recruitment to this population, and ask questions? And they ask questions about safety. Is this a safe space? What are initiatives that you're doing to support my identity? And we had to stand in there and answer those questions, but it was also good feedback. The other thing I would say is that own the reality. Own the reality that it is a negative stigma. And also, I think Aarika mentioned that earlier, if you are a counseling or mental health professional on a college campus or in an organization, and you are not out in front and accessible to the family support structure, grandma, everybody else, the aunts, uncles, friends, if you are not accessible, insert yourself into those orientation spaces, especially over the summer, because what you want to do is over the summer or those early exposure programs, you want them to take that access and take that conversation back home and say, what does this look like? Oh, or when, the support and mom or dad or aunt and uncle can't get to campus, or I can't reach I know they trust that the campus has resources in place, and now they're sending folks to you and recommending those services in hours that we may not be aware of. But think about how are you getting across. One of the things in the resources and recommendation was, I want you all to look up Paul Quinn College, a very cornerstone to particularly HBCU education, but Paul Quinn College is doing some very cool and unique things about innovative strategies about promoting positive health. And one of the things they're doing is they set up, they have a main counseling center, but they also have well-being satellite locations that are away from the main hub that students can normalize having these conversations, understand what mental health and accessing these services are. And they start noticing that people were increasing the traffic to visit these satellite services that was setting them up to know where the mental health counseling services were and to be able to access those resources on a reoccurring basis. So think about, it just has to be innovative ways. And a lot of what you may be trying to do, figure out what the students want. What are they looking for? Where are they hanging out? Do you have a satellite, below the dining hall? Because there's heavy foot traffic. Folks gonna love to eat, right? So if the more they see, like, oh, you're a mental health counselor, oh, you do this. Also normalizing, like, if there's a program in the residence hall, right? I'm here support. I am a counselor, but I'm supporting this program. My name is such and such, right? My name is Demarcus. So when they see me on campus, like, did I just see you in my residence hall? You actually right. My office is right over here. See, it's 2 steps around the corner. You thought it was all the way across campus. I'm in the building right behind you. So having those conversations, and then again, like Aarika said, so I have that one conversation with that young person, and then they go tell someone else, like, oh yeah, Demarcus, he's real cool. Like, you should go by and stop and see him. Actually, here's his LinkedIn information about scheduling an appointment, or here's his email address about setting up an appointment. And then you start to figure out that this is how we're accessing this. But I also think just as a higher education as a whole starts to better prioritize and raise the hypervisibility of mental health in how important it is, that students will start to normalize this as coming into as a part of the collegiate process, and not just a standoff, a one-off, or this just happened, so now I gotta go talk to somebody. People are still dealing with, like, well, I'm not crazy. Well, we're not saying that you're crazy, and you don't have to wait until something's wrong to go talk to somebody. You actually want you to talk to somebody before something goes wrong, right? So, and I think it's just continue to think around and about all those things, and really taking the temperature of your student population and seeing what are the best approaches for them, especially because it's such a diversity and breadth of students that are on our campuses.
Yeah. And you just hit on another note that made me think of something. And again, for those of you who have raised your hands, please type in what you were going to ask or say to us. We'll be more than happy to respond or feed your question or comment. The other thing that I will say is, I had a student reach out to me about a month ago and said, it seems like staff are struggling too. And I was like, we are, but we're here for you. And they asked us to share our story. And I don't know about you all. One, I'm very introverted in terms of that way. And yes, you could be a non-shy introvert. Introvert is how you get your energy, which I know most of you know. And I was like, I'm not sharing my personal business with you. I'm not sharing I go to counseling or whatever. But I realized that they may have never heard another adult tell them that. And so I don't necessarily have to say, well, this is what we talked about, but I shared it with somebody. The first counsel I went to, it just was not a connection. It just did not work. And they were a person of color, and it just did not work. The second counselor I went to, it did work. And I see them frequently. And this is how it's working. And some days I'm not in the mood for it, and some days I am, and they challenge me. But for some of those students, they've never heard that. So you can also, if you're comfortable and if you are and seeing someone, just mention it to them. You know, I go and whatever, and I know we try to get in the field about not bringing our personal stories into it. But for some of these students, and I always tell other people, students will tell us who we are in their lives. We don't get to determine who they are, who we are in their lives. So if they see us as that secondary relative on campus, and you know, if you're that, again, that go-to person where they come to you, I'm having this issue, I'm having this issue, or I'm having a great day, that you may be that person now that they've chosen to help them navigate this process, even if it's not your role. And so how do you leverage that as well is really important. I know student affairs and professionals in higher ed always talk about, I changed my major, I did this, but do we ever talk about our struggles out of COVID? I've learned so much, and I have so much respect, and looking at Demarcus here, people who are parents or caretakers over the last 2 years, because I don't have children or dependents. And so when someone says, I need to go pick up my kid from school, or I need to go pick up my parent and take them to, you go right ahead. And so it's things like that we need to also normalize, that we're humans as well. And sometimes we try to act like we're superhumans, and we're not. And remembering, our students will be our peers or colleagues in just a matter of years. And so they're not always going to be that 18-year-old student. So normalizing some of these things in our conversations with them is really important. And I thank you all for those of you who are doing that, being open to that as well. And yes, I would agree. I'm constantly surprised the pedestal some of them put us on, because I'm like, I wouldn't put me on that, but thanks. I saw another question as well about, can you explain the narratives? And so Demarcus, you had the slide up of believe the numbers, but also trust the narrative. So can you give a little bit more about that qualitative aspect to research?
Yeah, so the narratives are typically, and this is based on how you collect your research, but also sometimes just how you observe the culture and how the movements and behavior of your students. But if you're doing any kind of formalized assessment, please have a plan in place on how you are going to, what are you going to do with the research? As when I went through my initial research class, one of the tenets that they told us that was most important was, as explain the process, the research process to your survey group, but also tell them, what are you going to do with the data? Is it going to be published? Am I going to use it? So sometimes we don't close that loop of assessment by telling them, saying, this is what we heard. This is what we plan to do. 54% of the students said that we don't know where the counseling center is on campus. We plan to relocate it. We heard you. And thinking of those type of responses, and about what are you doing with the narrative and the data that you're getting, but also looking at it and saying, hey, within those narratives that are being shared, how can we support this? How can we hear your journey? How can we try to understand what's going on and utilize that information? Because a lot of times we are attracted to the numbers because it's a large number and saying this, so it's easier and less complicated. And it takes more time with qualitative data, kind of dig through, and you have to understand, you have to take time to draw themes. You also have to make sure you're drawing connections, but also, what 100 people are feeling and giving feedback on is just as important what that one person is saying. How are we checking on folks, and how are we checking in? And again, I advocate for people to lean into the narrative. And sometimes it can be very uncomfortable because it's saying, well, I don't think this service is accessible. I don't think this service reflects me. This is their truth. How do we hold it? Right? We hold it, and now let's do something with it. And I think we have to just do a better job of telling students and staff of, we want to collect your narrative, and we care, whether it's a focus group, whether it's an assessment, whether it's an anonymous survey. What are you doing with my truth? right? And how many times do I have to retell my truth in order for something to happen, in order for me to be supported? So I think if we start to challenge ourselves with this questioning, that we will start to paint a more holistic picture about what we need to do when it comes to mental health. And again, normalizing what it is and saying, hey, your story was heard, and this is how you shaped the campus. This is how you impacted the culture to change. And we appreciate it. And don't forget to thank them, because sharing your truth, it's a journey within itself, right? And some folks are generational giants because nobody in their family has ever accessed counseling. So that is a major hurdle that they're overcoming and setting a new trend and setting a new habit and behavior within their circle alone.
Thank you, Demarcus. And I see Juliana's came on, because Juliana makes sure we stay on time, by the way. But if you're like, can I give one more piece of advice really quickly? One, if you have not been into your student counseling center this semester, please do. And so you can also physically describe the space to a student, because if they're sitting across from you talking to you, there must be some level or modicum of trust there. So this is how it looks like when you walk in. Also, that staff really appreciates people coming in and checking on them. And the one last thing I'll share is I learned this in Miami and I hated doing it. But we have a tendency in the world, not just in higher ed, to walk by. Hi, Juliana, how you doing? Good? Okay, gotta keep it moving. If you're gonna ask someone how they're doing, listen to the response. And if they're telling you great, and you know that that's not what their great looks like, take a second and listen and probe more. If you don't have time to listen to the answer, don't ask the question of how you're doing. And so with that, I'm very appreciative, Juliana, that you allowed Demarcus and I to share this time with everyone. And so we'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. I think that I'm the one appreciative of your guys' presentation. Thank you so much. And to your point, Aarika, there have been times where I have, entered someone's office or room and just started talking or said, hey, how you doing? And then move right in. And then I'm like, you know what? Let me back up. I got to go back. How are you doing? So I really appreciate that you said that, because that is a lesson learned as well for me in all the environments I've been in. And it's appreciated. Absolutely. So I wanted to ask if it's okay if any one of our attendees would be able to reach out to either one of you for any kind of follow-up, guidance, questions, anything like that.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And we are going to put the evaluation link in the chat for you to access. We really appreciate you filling out the link. And thank you again so much, Demarcus and Aarika, for your guidance, your presentation, the information you have given. I know I couldn't take enough notes fast enough, but I really do appreciate you spending the time to give us your expertise and thoughts and feedback on this topic, as it's very, very important. And I think that you presented a lot of great actions that people can take on campus to enhance what they're already doing. Yeah. So I really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course, my pleasure.
All right, so please fill out the survey. Ashley put it in the link there. And then also in the chat is the registration for December's Rise and Thrive webinar.
Thank you, everyone. And then our email addresses are there, and